Hi, I'm Steven. You can now watch UCF TV 24 hours a day on Bright House Digital Channel 1.
This is how it begins, really, right, for me. A child of 4 who learned to read at 2, but at 4 I'm reading my first book by myself for the first time. Oh, by the way, this is not a sponsorship thing, because I see you've got cameras. Barnes & Noble. But my first book was Watership Down. Watership Down is one of those wonderful books that they write for children that has so much darkness in it. It makes Harry Potter look like nothing. And it really began to change my life. It put me on a journey that I think I am still on, in a sense. I grew up reading a lot. I was a geek, a nerd, whatever you want to call me. I grew up reading in a kind of privileged environment, so to speak. I grew up reading in small libraries in small towns that were not arranged hierarchically. So there was no other way in which books and comic books were shelved other than alphabetically. So Dostoevsky was sitting there right next to Dr. Doom, as it should have been. And so I grew up falling in love with the Silver Surfer, with Raskolnikov from Dostoevsky's books, and with Rufus from Baldwin's Another Country. It's really interesting to talk. I think it's important to talk about growing up before I talk about the other things, because we don't want to come away with a one-dimensional picture of where I come from. It's often odd to say when you're an African that you come from a lot of privilege, because most people, when they think about Africa, they think about the 1980s with starving children in Ethiopia. So never think about high-rises and beautiful buildings in Lagos, and never think about upper-middle-class Nigerians. But I was a kid from the suburbs who had a very privileged upbringing. My father worked very highly for the government. He was a national ombudsman. And so I grew up with this, not just this sort of middle-class privilege, but this incredible intellectual privilege. I grew up in a house where the Bhagavad Gita sat next to the Quran, sat next to the Bible, where the local imam would come to argue with my father after church on Sunday about whether Jesus was truly the Son of God or whether he was just a prophet. I used to love those arguments. So all of this led me to think that I could write a book. Isn't that funny? So I started writing very early. When I was 10, there was a short story competition for 18-year-olds being run by the state newspaper. And if you won, you got be like 100 naira, so it'd be like $2, but it was a lot of money back then. And you would get your story published. So I wrote this story, I sent it off, and I won. And I came to receive the prize. It was set up like this. There was some dudes on stage handing out things. And I don't know if you've noticed, but I've been growing my belly for a while. So when I was 10, I was just like a kind of compressed version of myself. I looked like a basketball, essentially. And so I was like, I remember bouncing down the aisle to come and get this prize. And taking in this kind of look of shock and surprise on everyone's face that a 10-year-old was the one who won this prize. And without really being able to articulate it properly then, I realized that literature, that art, is one of the most powerful things in the world, that it can intervene in things in ways you don't think are possible. And that has essentially become my life's work, is to catalog, to organize, to present, to put into difficult situations of conflict human beings who are often like us and sometimes not like us. And I push them into these difficult positions to see if it is actually possible to have any kind of transformation, if it is possible to lean into transcendence, if it is even possible that we can find out what it truly means to be human. And so, over the course of my writing career, I've come to believe one thing very true, that we're never more beautiful than when we're most ugly, because that's the only time we can really understand what we're capable of. And that's the only time we really begin to understand what goodness can really mean. So everything we need to know about ourselves is already contained in literature. Most of us writers today, we're sort of clever plagiarists. If you think about, in many ways, all of the holy books, from the Bhagavad Gita to the Bible, have covered all of the stories that need to be told. If you really want to understand any of your American presidents, you only have to read the Book of David, and you'll really see this. When I was 10, I went to seminary to become a Catholic priest. I decided I was going to do that. And it all started with a lie I told. I'm very good at that. That's why I write books. It's true. Just lie really well. So I was growing up in a very Catholic home. My mother had converted from the Church of England to Catholicism when she married my father. And I don't know if you know anything about Catholicism, but there's no one more rabid than a converted Catholic. They're the worst kind. They really are. This is what my mother did to me. When I was 8, my mother started to teach the Billings ovulation method, which is the only birth control system that is approved of by the Catholic Church. So my mother would take me into these villages where most of the women spoke only Igbo, and so she needed me to translate. Now, the Billings ovulation method involves discussing women's periods with them. Now, these are women who'd never discussed their period with their husbands. And there's this 8-year-old boy saying to women in their 40s and 30s, so how often do you get your period? And is it thick? How heavy is the flow? How swollen is the vulva? And my father hated this. He said she was teaching me how to be a woman. And my mother said, somebody has to. My mother wasn't a feminist in the real ways we think about feminists, but she really was. She used to say, anything a man can do, I can fix, which I think is really true. But it's really important to understand, in a way, how I come to be who I am through largely these different experiences. My mother is white English. My father was black Nigerian. So in a way, I'm biracial, tricultural even, multilingual. And that has a lot to do with how my aesthetic occupies this nebulous, ambiguous zone, and that's often what has made my work threatening to people. My mother is so English. This is how English my mother was. She just passed away. When she came to California 2 years ago, we went to get food in Malibu, and Chad was our waiter. And Chad came up to the table and said, yeah, so like for the specials, we'll like have like this salmon that's like sauteed in like this wasabi like crust, and like it's totally like rad. And my mother said, what language is he speaking? And I said English, and she sighed and she said, oh, Americans, we gave them a language, why don't they use it? So if I'm any kind of political activist, you can see where a lot of it comes from. You can blame my mother for this. So I'm growing up. I was born when the Civil War began in Nigeria. My father blamed me for that. My father blamed me for a lot of things. It's the nature of fathers and sons. And we left the Civil War. My mother was trying to get through this Biafran civil war. She's a white woman with 5 black children. 2 years it takes her to make it from where we were to where we can get on a plane to leave for London. All that time, my mother never cried one time until we were in Lisbon airport about to leave for London. My mother's wearing a dress that's been washed so many times it's transparent. She has a pair of torn flip-flops on. We're wearing rags. And so this English woman who's on holiday in the Algarve because Portugal had suddenly become this huge destination for the English, walks up to my mother and says, "Why are you dressed like this?" My mother explained that we just left a war. And this woman walks over and brings her suitcase and empties it and gives all of us her children's clothes and gives my mother her clothes. And that's when my mother cried. And years later, I was writing about my mother, and I said, "Why is it that made you cry?" And she said to me, "You can steel your heart against the most horrible things in the world, but the random kindness of strangers will unstitch you." And this is important to remember, because a lot of my work is really about the ideas of redemption. Is it possible for us to be redeemed? Not in any biblical sense, not in any religious sense. I told you that I went to seminary because when I was a kid, I believed so much in the Virgin Mary that when I went to the local bishop's house, he had a grotto built with a glass panel in it. And the rumor was that if you were really pious, you could see the Virgin Mary. And so I lied, and I said I saw the Virgin Mary. So my mother said, "Well, off to seminary with you." So I went to Jesuit seminary to be a priest and got kicked out shortly afterwards. This is a theme in my life. I get kicked out of many things. Seminaries, universities, countries. I was just kicked out of a session in Davos at the World Economic Forum where I asked Musharraf if he had anything to do with Benazir Bhutto's death. And then the Swiss police came over and said, "Would you like to come this way, please?" I said, "Okay." A lot of who I am comes from those books. Oftentimes when you ask a writer who influences them, writers will tell you the list of people who've won Nobel Prizes. I was mostly influenced by DC and Marvel comic books, by William Golding's Lord of the Flies. It's actually in Lord of the Flies I really began to understand as a young seminarian what the concept of innocence and its loss was. I don't know if you read Lord of the Flies? Not Lord of the Rings, Lord of the Flies, different book. In Lord of the Flies, it's the essential Survivor book. It predates Survivor. Predates Lost. Do you watch Lost? Come on, you guys must watch Lost. Hey, one lost fan in the house. This is sad. You guys need to watch more television. I probably shouldn't say that. Your professors are squirming right now. In Lord of the Flies, a plane crashes, and they're all teenagers on this plane, young kids from 9 to 13. And they quickly devolve, and they begin to attack each other. And Golding creates a sense of an overwhelming darkness over the island, which these kids then decide is a god that needs to be worshipped. So they go and they hunt a pig, and they kill this pig, and they hack the pig's head off, and then they drive the pig's head onto a stake as an offering to this unseen force. But as that pig begins to bleed, that black blood begins to drip down from the pig, these children scatter in fear, except for one child who remains. In the book, his name is Simon, and Simon becomes the archetypal mystic or saint. And Simon begins to cry in front of this bleeding pig. And years it took me to realize that he wasn't crying for the pig, because when you're a kid, you think, "Oh, they killed a pig, they killed Babe." But he was crying for the loss of innocence, for that moment that can never be regained. It's interesting how the things we read begin to become the things that we are. So coming back after the Civil War, I was a Biafran, which meant I was Igbo, which meant my people had been slaughtered in northern Nigeria, 200,000, 300,000 of us, killed in pogroms, hacked up. Women had babies pulled out of their wombs. Bodies were packed into trains and shipped down south. When we seceded from the Nigerian government, a war was declared on us. We lost that war. When we came back, we became an occupied territory. So I grew up in the detritus of the war, but without any real knowledge, bearing in mind that I was a child when this started. I didn't really know what the war had been about. I was playing in burnt-out tanks. My cousin had his hand blown off when we were playing catch with a grenade that we found. but no one would talk about the war. It was forbidden in schools. Our parents just wanted to put it behind them. So Mr. Khalid, who was my teacher in primary school, we had a lot of Indian teachers actually in Nigeria in those days. When I came back, from the time I was 6 to the time I was 8, everyone in my village who went to primary school sounded like Apu from The Simpsons because our English teacher was Indian. So everybody talked like this all the time. Not out of irony, just that's how we learned to talk, you see. And it's a wonderful way to grow up, to have a mishmash of cultures that are not hierarchical, not arranged in terms of racial preference, but just simply thrown out into this stew. So Mr. Khalid decides that he has to teach us, these young Biafran children, about this war. So he decides the best way to do it is to teach us about the Jewish Holocaust. And so surrounding pictures of children dying in camps in the Second World War, the young Igbo children in my town learned their melancholic history through another people's melancholic history. And this is what's really important to remember about art, about story, is that it travels and that it can contain all of your pain and that all of your pain can communicate with somebody else's pain. In fact, that's essentially what story is. That's what art is supposed to do. It's supposed to say, I am human, you're human. This is a neutral place in which we can talk about this. In fact, Baldwin said that your suffering means nothing unless someone else can connect their suffering to yours. And this is really what I've been trying to do all my life. I've been trying to become a human being. The Buddhists say that the first stage of enlightenment is to become human. And I still haven't figured how to do that. It's like being in AA. It's like you get up and you go, my name is Chris Abani. I've been human for 4 days now. But then there was this bad traffic and I cussed out everyone on the street. It's a work in progress. So at 16, I decided to write a novel. And because Mr. Khalid had taught me so much about the Holocaust, I decided to write a novel like The Born Identity, but that was about neo-Nazis taking over Nigeria to start the Fourth Reich. It's a very preposterous plot. Didn't make any sense, but who cared? I was 16. It was a good story. In order to do this, they have to cripple the country. It's a military dictatorship, so they have to make sure that the army cannot stop them. So in my novel, they blow up strategic targets. Now, I learned how to do this by watching successive coup attempts in my country. 1966, there was the first coup. Halfway through 66, there was a second coup. 1974, there was a third coup. 76, there was the fourth coup. 78, there was an attempted coup. 79, they hand over to civilians. 1983, there is another military coup. 84, there's another military coup. And it goes on, 85, and it goes on, 87, until Abacha finally dies in the 90s, and we have a democracy again. So I had lots of places to draw inspiration from. However, when the book is published, and it goes on to do well, the then president of the Association of Nigerian Authors was a general named Maman Vatsa. Maman Vatsa was in charge of building the new capital in Abuja. And apparently he had a disagreement with the then military head of state, Ibrahim Babangida, who then decided that General Vatsa had attempted a coup against him. And when he was arrested, apparently amongst his papers were my novel, and amongst the coup papers was a plot to blow up the country that had been lifted directly from my novel. So here I am, 18 years old. I've been watching these trucks turn up to disappear people every day. We're studying in the library. We see the trucks roll up. We all run to the window to see who's been disappeared, only to find out that it's Chris Abani. So I was arrested as a co-conspirator. I had no idea what was going on. I wasn't political. I was a kid from the suburbs who had just written a novel for fun. 6 months, they put me in prison. It was difficult, but nothing like what was to come. The torture was minimum. It was just beatings. So 6 months later, they decided there's no point holding me, and they released me. My mother's theory was that I ate them out of house and home. So, that stomach again, eh? But what happened is 18 and a half, I suddenly began to realize that I had been living in a privileged 20% of my country. 80% of them were living below the subsistence level. They were at the mercy of military dictatorships. In other words, you can grow up amidst all of the detritus of war. You can grow up amidst all of this stuff, and you only see what your parents allow you to see. And for the first time, I became heavily politicized. And I decided to do something about it. And I joined a generation. It's never one person. Always when these stories get told, one person tells a story, and then that person has to bear the burden of everyone else's nobility. But it was a whole generation of us decided that we were going to oppose the military government. And we decided to borrow ideas from Martin Luther King Jr., from Mahatma Gandhi, from Wole Soyinka, from Ngugi wa Thiong'o. We were going to use art, and it was going to be nonviolent revolution. We believed that if we performed theater in public places, if we got passers-by to perform theater, if they performed revolution long enough, they would begin to enact revolution. Soldiers would come at us with live ammunition, with tanks, and we would stand there singing songs, Babangida must go, Babangida must go, ripping pages from Pablo Neruda's books and throwing poems at tanks like idiots. I wouldn't recommend that. Many people died, many people were shot, many students were killed. I was arrested again, spent another year in prison. This time, it's almost like the first time had been a dress rehearsal. This time, it was bad. There was a group of us. We were tortured daily, beatings, rape with foreign objects, electrocution. Teeth were pulled, cigarettes stubbed out in the wounds. They would take us out and shoot they would take 12 people out, they would hood you, and they would shoot 4 people. You never knew which 4 were going to be shot. This was not at the command of the government, by the way. This is just the prison guards having fun. It's a bit like Abu Ghraib, isn't it? When I came out of that 1 year, I was very broken. I had come in as an arrogant young man, believing that I could change the world, believing that somehow I had imbibed the Silver Surfer's powers. And I left a very broken, very discouraged person. But then my university made a mistake, and they asked me to write the commencement play 6 months later that the head of state was supposed to attend. So I wrote a play called Song of a Broken Flute, in which basically we insulted the president's mother's genitalia. It wasn't a very good play, but it was effective. Within 10 minutes, they sealed off the building and fired tear gas into the room. They arrested everybody, the cast, the crew, and the audience. They let the audience go after about an hour because the audience should have left before they fired in the tear gas. And they gave me a choice. I was a 20-something-year-old kid. And they said to me, here's a piece of paper. Sign it, waiving your rights to trial, accepting that you're guilty of treason and accepting the death penalty. If you sign it, we will release the cast and crew, 12 people. If you do not sign it, we will release you and execute them and make you watch. Now, when things like this happen, if you go back to the books that I was talking about, there's always Deus ex machina, there's always something to save you. And there wasn't. And always we think as human beings that the really important decisions are the easy decisions to make. It took me 2 weeks to sign that paper. If you ask me till today why I signed it, I don't think it's because I was brave or better or courageous. I think that I probably signed it because it seemed easier for me to die or to accept the possibility of death than it was to live, having watched 12 people be killed for you. So, after prison again, I spent 18 months on death row. 6 months of that is in solitary confinement. It was on death row that I met John James, a 14-year-old boy who had been arrested because his father, who was related to Major Oka, who was apparently another coup plotter, had been arrested because when they went to arrest his father had fled, so they took the son as ransom. Somehow, his father never knew. So here's this boy on death row with 2 comic books, Spider-Man and the X-Men. And he would read and reread these comic books. This 14-year-old boy was full of joy. And he started to teach the other men on death row who couldn't read how to read. And he always used to say to me, you know, the reason these men are criminals is because they can't read. If they were not illiterate, they wouldn't be criminals. And so he was teaching these bad, hardened men. They weren't all political prisoners. There were some really bad people there. How to read with Spider-Man. And you'd sort of see these hardened men squatting around this 14-year-old kid saying, take that, Spidey. It was very funny. John James was killed. They got bored one day and they took him and they handcuffed him to a chair and they nailed his penis to a table with a 6-inch nail. And they left him there. And he bled to death 3 days later. That's when some of us decided it was time to organize a prison riot, and that's when ultimately I ended up in prison, in solitary confinement, which in Kirikiri, which is unlike any other Nigerian prison, meant you dug a hole in the ground in the prison, and they put you in there, and they covered it up with a wooden plank and 4 foot of earth with a little hatch. So you never saw any light, you never heard anyone speak, you never saw anyone for 6 months. And so you lose language. It's funny, isn't it? This conversation wouldn't have been able to happen. The South Africans have a philosophy that's called Ubuntu. And Ubuntu essentially says that I can be human only in as much as you can reflect my humanity back to me. In other words, in America, we're taught to believe that the individual is where everything begins and where everything ends. But actually, the truth of the matter is that you don't know anything about yourself except in reflection with other people. So essentially, imagine then if you're taken away from community. So when I came out of prison, I was eventually bought out of prison and I ended up in London. I had forgotten how to have conversations. I was that weird dude in the office who would be like getting coffee in the coffee room, and you'd walk up to him and be like, "Hey, Chris, how's your day?" And I'd be like, "Well, I'm not having the nightmares anymore, and well, I don't dream about torture now." And people feel like, "Dude, I was just asking how you were, with you." Literature saved my life. I began to go back to novels again, to go back to writers like Toni Morrison, to go back to a book like Beloved, where one person can encapsulate an entire people's pain, not just black people, but white people too, because this is one of the conundrums of torture, the conundrums of oppression, of suppression, is that you, the torturer, are as brutalized as the person you torture. This is something people don't understand. That there is no way to oppress anyone without yourself being oppressed. Let's just take the case of South Africa under apartheid, which you are a white South African, but you cannot really be free because you cannot have friends who are black South Africans. This is at a very basic level, the ways in which this begins to enact. But the ways in which that trauma goes into a people's psyche is amazing, and yet here she takes it and she transforms it. And actually, when I was reading Beloved, I remembered something that used to happen when I was growing up after the Civil War. The old women in my village would always plant the rice. And they had memorized the names of everybody who died during the Civil War from that village. And as they planted the rice, they would sing the names of these people as though they were seeding the dead into the rice that would bloom. And when they would harvest the rice, they would sing the names of every child that had been born in that year. And then next year, when they planted the rice again, the names of the dead would decrease in proportion to the children who had been born. In this way, these women quietly were going about enacting transformation. And so this is really at the core of what I try to do, is to ask, how do you go from this place where language has abandoned you, from this place where your humanity comes into question, where you have to question the essential goodness of people. How do you go from that into a language that speaks to transformation without, and this is the difficult part, without pretending away any of that darkness? In the West, we're always taught that healing is the erasure of trauma. But I think that healing is really learning to live with a damaged self. And that means, how do you live with a self that is damaged, that is seeking not to damage others, but only to find its own redemption? So in a sense, this is the story of my books. I wouldn't be the writer I am today. I was a writer before I went to prison, so I'm not a writer because I went to prison or because things happened to me. But I am the writer I am today because of a lot of those things, because in many ways, from all of the amazing childhood I had to this difficult moment, when you put it all together, it really gives you a unique and privileged position that you can look into the human psyche and you can believe, contrary to what people actually want to believe about themselves, that they are good. It's the funniest thing, isn't it? We don't really want to believe we're good. Who wants that? It's too much work. And this is essentially what my literature tries to enact. So I'm going to stop talking for a minute, and I'm going to read you some of the work I've done. And then after that, we can do some questions and answers, and that will enable you to further open up the conversation. That sound good? So I'm going to, see, I'm a writer, and writers can't organize their way out of a paper bag. And so I have everything back to front. Just give me 1 minute. Tell jokes while I'm doing this. Have you heard the one about the plane in South Africa that was going to crash? And the plane was going to crash, and the pilot comes out and says, it's a plane full of, this was during apartheid, and the plane is full of only white people, except for a black man and his 2 kids. And the plane is going down, and so the pilot says, ladies and gentlemen, we need to lose some weight from the plane, so we're asking volunteers to step up and jump off the plane. Nobody moves. So he says, well, we're going to do it democratically. We're going to go alphabetically. Will all Africans please come forward? Nobody moves. So they look around and he says, okay, will all blacks please come forward? Nobody moves. And he goes, will all coloreds please come forward? Again, nobody moves. So the son says to his father, Dad, if we're not black, we're not African, and we're not colored, what are we? And he said, today, my son, we are Zulus. Okay, here we go. See, it worked. So I'm going to read from Song for Night. Song for Night is about a young boy soldier from West Africa. He's unlike other boy soldiers you might have heard of. He cannot speak. He's a mind diffuser. His job with his platoon is to go through minefields, diffusing mines. Now, there's a long, proud, worldwide tradition of using children as mind diffusers. In Iran, after the Iran-Iraq war, the Ayatollah Khomeini would send droves of children into the minefields to get blown up to clear the mines. And he would hang a picture of himself around their necks to guarantee them entrance into paradise. These children were called the doves of peace. And what was most tragic is that it oftentimes wasn't the mine that would kill them, but when the glass exploded from the frames, the glass would lacerate them and cut them to death. In other countries, particularly we find in certain parts of West Africa, the kids, when they were sent into a minefield, to use their toes to find the mines and use a machete to disarm it, that they would sometimes get blown up and that they would scream. And when they screamed, the rest of the children would scatter in the minefield and get blown up. So to stop this, they cut their vocal cords so that they couldn't scream. So my luck cannot speak because his vocal cords are being cut. He's been separated from his unit and he's trying to find them. As he journeys through the war, you follow him. But the thing is that my luck tells you his story entirely in the first-person narrative. The only other thing you need to know is that every section I read is preceded by sign language that these children have invented to talk to each other. Memory is a pattern cut into an arm. It was Wednesday late afternoon, and the sky heavy with dark clouds. The muted light that fell like a hush was darkened by the deep green of foliage to one side, the red unpaved road scar in the middle, and to the other side, a clearing covered with the gleam of white gravel and a church, not much more than a low whitewashed bungalow with a cross atop its corrugated iron roof, half of which had collapsed, maybe from a shell or a mortar. It was hard to tell. Another bungalow, the priest's house, was off to the back, set close to the encroaching greenery. In the front of the church was a battered pickup truck that was idling in the shade of a tree. A white priest, neck and face red against his white soutane, sat in the cab. In the shadow of the bombed-out church, 2 women were washing a statue of the Virgin with all the tenderness of a mother washing a child. A 7-year-old girl played in the gravel by their feet. I stared at that sight unbelievingly. Of all the things they could have salvaged, I remembered thinking, there was something so matter-of-fact about it all that was so heartbreaking. And John Wayne stopped us with a casual wave, and we spread out wordlessly into the formation we had been trained to. The people in the church tableau froze as we approached, the man holding Jesus, the women washing the Virgin, and the priest in the truck, whom I assume meant to carry the statues to another church or parish. As we approached in a loose fan that tapered into a point, with John Wayne leading, only the child moved. Smiling, she ran towards us, and John Wayne bent down, arms spread, a father home from work, except he didn't look like a father, more like a bird of prey. He picked up the 7-year-old girl and held her to his side, and something about him in that moment must have terrified her, because she began to cry. "What is your name?" he asked her. "Faith," she said, still crying, and John Wayne touched her face tenderly, and then when she smiled tentatively through her tears, he threw his head back and laughed. "This one is ripe. I will enjoy her," he said, looking right at me, as though he expected me to challenge him, like I did the first time he forced me at gunpoint to rape someone. But whatever he saw in my eyes made him laugh even louder. Without thinking, I lifted my AK-47 and opened fire, and he moved instinctively, I think, the way an animal will, to escape the shot, and the bullet went through the 7-year-old girl and found his heart. They both looked at me, faces wide with shock for a long moment. Then John Wayne fell, taking the girl with him. Everyone scattered for cover. The women, the man carrying Jesus, still carrying Jesus, and the rest of the platoon. Everyone except the priest, who leapt out of the car and ran towards John Wayne and the girl, and Ijoma, my girlfriend, who stood behind me. Without a word, the priest bent down, said a prayer over the child, kissed her forehead, and drew a cross in the air above her with 2 fingers. He pried her from John Wayne's arms and held her to his chest, her blood staining his white soutane. He seemed confused, unsure what to do next, and his eyes, locked on mine, were filled with tears and an expression I have seen too many times. And he opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came. I was numb to John Wayne's death. Gladness will come later. Now, all I could think was that the only real casualty was faith. Imagination is a forefinger between the eyes. What does it mean to hide in a ceiling, in that narrow, hot crawl space, crouched like an animal, smelling my own scent, full of it and grateful for it, while my mother stays below, in what seems like the brightest sunlight, although it is only the light of a 60-watt bulb, waiting to deflect the anger of people intent on murder, my murder, waits so that I may live, and I watch what happens below, and I'm grateful that I can smell my smell and live, while below me it happens. It happens that night bright as day, but I cannot name it, those things that happened while I watched, and I cannot speak something that was never in words. Speak of things I cannot imagine, could never have seen even as I saw them, and I hide, and I'm grateful for my smell, crouched like an animal in that dark, hot crawl space, while below me my mother dies. Cowardice, spit once. A wind sets to howling in the flaming tree, and I shiver in fear. I know it is the wind, but it might also be disembodied spirits, or ghosts, or demons. The amount of blood on my hands does not grant me the luxury of complacence, and no amount of horror seems to have inured me to my own pain, or fear, or hunger, or desire. Only to those of others. War and its attendant deviance hasn't made me braver, only more callous. If any one of my men could see me now, they would spit at my feet, the sign for cowardice. The wind is calling in a voice I remember. A man John Wayne chased down into a woman's kitchen. A man unarmed and afraid, and John pulled him out and made him butcher his children in front of us, in that kitchen, as though he would make a gory feast of them, as though he was a host and we his invited guests. And as that man chopped with the machete, blood spattering his face, I flinched from the greed in his eyes, the greed for living that made him do that gladly. And then when he was done and panting from the effort, John Wayne put his revolver point blank to the man's head and blew his brains across the kitchen wall. Tonight, he's howling in the wind, but I cannot tell if it is anger, shame, or remorse. Dreaming, hands held in prayer over the nose. Maybe this is true, that there are some of us who give love and some of us who take love, and that those who give can't help giving, just as those who take can't help taking. And maybe this is what keeps the world in balance. Thank you. So, if you have any questions, I know you've just been assaulted with some difficult material, but I have a question. Does anybody here know anybody in a war? This is happening to your children right now. I think this is the things we don't realize. That when you take people who are 19, 20 sometimes, people who you wouldn't trust with their own laundry, and then you put them with guns, and we wonder what happens to them. You know, I think that oftentimes in political rhetoric, we forget these basic human questions. The war is not about Iraqis dying for you. It shouldn't even be about that. It should be about the trauma you're inflicting on your own children. And they will come home and inflict that trauma on other children. And so the cycle of hate continues. There is no such thing as a just war. There is no such thing as justified torture. You know, I teach, and the kids leave my classroom and don't come back. And we pretend that it didn't happen. And you ask the other kids, what happened to so-and-so? And they go, I guess he never made it back from Iraq. So when I speak about these things, when I speak about my experience, what I'm really trying to communicate to you is it's not for you to feel for me. It's not for you to feel that this happens in other places. It's for you to feel your own humanness and feel the ways in which we're all connected. So I wanted to preface that so that if you had any questions, no matter how difficult or inappropriate you think they are, they're all perfectly legitimate and acceptable.
How you doing? I'm a U.S. Marine. I've been to Iraq 3 times. I turned 19, 20, and 21 there, so I understand where you're coming from on the war front. I just want to know, because I kind of follow international conflicts now, what can you tell us about the men movement down in the Nigerian Delta, where some of the oil workers are being kidnapped, or any of that situation? Can you tell us about what's happening on the ground?
Did you all hear the question? Right. So this is an old problem. Nigeria has 250 ethnic groups, 250 languages, 2,000 dialects. We're a nation that were manufactured by the British. The civil war in Nigeria could have been averted had it not been for the oil. When we decided as the Biafrans to secede, we went to Ghana, and the Organization of African Unity, then headed by Emperor Haile Selassie, signed the Aburi Accord, which allowed the Biafrans to secede peacefully. And when Gowon, who was the head of state, came back, people said, particularly Lyndon Johnson, to quote your president, he said, "We cannot afford to have a Japan in Africa. If they have the oil, they will become a world leader." So they reneged on that. So the Igbos are in many ways considered the oppressed of Nigeria. They're the third biggest group. The Ogonis, the Urobo, the people on whose land the oil actually lives, are also oppressed by the Igbos. And this is the thing that's difficult to talk about sometimes in a context like Nigeria that is so ethnically charged, that everyone believes themselves to be a victim, but the real victims are the people who own that land. We have been, and this is not the global, I don't actually blame the global corporations, I blame the Nigerian government. This is the only country in the world where private corporations own private armies and massacre people. So the Ogonis and all the others in that Niger Delta, all the oil is dumped that's not used, so they cannot farm their lands, they can no longer fish their creeks, there are no schools in their neighborhoods, there are no hospitals for them. They have basically almost no means of living. Every time they protest, other Nigerians come in and massacre them. They kill them. So I think what's happened in 1994 when Ken Saro-Wiwa was hung, who was the then one person who had as an environmental activist there. The world paid attention for a while, but what the world does, and this is why I spoke about myself in terms of generations, not as an individual, is that we make saints out of people. And when you sanctify a person, you can pretend the problem no longer exists. So Ken Saro-Wiwa was murdered by the Nigerian government. Everybody in the West has sanctified him. The problem continues and no one addresses it. These people are fighting for their lives, for their children's lives, and no one is paying any attention. When they started to take workers at first, it was simply to gain attention. But of course, what always happens in any kind of situation like that is that there are opportunists who suddenly go, wait a minute, instead of kidnapping these oil workers to get press attention, we should start ransoming them back. And so suddenly what could have been a very peaceful, if you can call kidnapping someone peaceful, but a non-violent protest has suddenly begun to escalate now into armed conflict. And as what we do in Nigeria is that we're so good at pretending that these things are not there. And I don't just mean the government, I mean everyday middle-class Nigerians who drive cars with gas from those regions. So what we have is a situation that is escalating out of control rapidly. The world is focused on Sudan. When that conflict is brought under control, the Niger Delta will erupt again. And in a country that is so charged ethnically, where a civil war happened not long ago, where people are still angry, it will escalate into another civil war in that country. That's what my reading of that situation is. The solution? The Nigerian government has to do the responsible thing. They have to force oil companies to give back. They have to find viable reparations for these people. That's what they need to do. And they have enough experience with this to disarm those rebels. So that's what's going on.
When did you realize that you defeated the evil, or when did you realize that the evil didn't defeat you?
Generationally, I think I left Nigeria in 1992 after being released. In 1993, as a mass, Nigerians rose up and rejected the military dictatorships after they murdered Abiola, who was our freely elected president. So I think that was the first sign that we as a generation of young people had gotten through 1993. The other thing that has really been profound to me is that I just recently was in Davos and I met a lot of young Africans, Nigerians, Kenyans, and when you speak to a Westerner, they say where you're from, you go Africa, and then if they know Africa, they'll ask you where, and you go West Africa, and if they know West Africa, they'll ask you where, and you say Nigeria, and they go, oh. But if you're from those countries, you go, but who are you? And you always say Igbo, Yoruba, or Hausa. This has been, when I was growing up, my father was educated in Oxford. My father was a strange man. But when we were living in Nigeria in this occupied sense, all the army were Hausa, and the police force in Igbo land were all Yorubas. And we would have to go and do an Independence Day celebration. And he would say to me, don't you ever go into a Yoruba person's house and ask them for water if you're thirsty, because they will poison you. And what a strange thing to tell a child. I mean, I can understand his paranoia. I often thought about poisoning him myself, but that's beside the point. The point is that in this way, subtle hatreds are being passed along. What would any Yoruba person, a mother who has children just like me, why would she poison me? These are some of the ridiculous, this is the depths to which sometimes this ethnic ridiculousness can go in that country. But to stand in Davos with people who were born in the 80s And to ask them, what is your ethnic affiliation? And they said, we don't have one. We're Nigerians and we're Kenyans. That for me was it, because what it says to me, I'm 41 years old. That means my generation has stopped it. It stopped with us. There's no more hatred being passed on. That's how I know. And those kids in 5, 10, 15 years will take over the reins of power across that continent, and you will see what will happen. There's a lot to be hopeful for. It's amazing. Does that, excuse me, does that answer the question?
My question is, have you had an opportunity, whether it's at Davos or in other settings where there were leaders of countries around the world who heard the message that you delivered to us there? And was their reaction very much like ours, total silence, shock, not knowing what to say?
Thank you. Yes, I mean, lots of people spoke in Davos, and from the writers, Elie Wiesel spoke, Ishmael Beyer spoke, I spoke. Yes, they heard. I don't know, there's a part of me that is cynical. I think that part of their silence was because they were embarrassed that we had called them out in a public setting. I don't know that they don't know what's going on. I think that people, a lot of the people who work in big business had no idea, really. And they were shocked and they were stunned. And this is my hope, particularly the Chinese, you know. One of the wonderful things in my life is people will tell me things. They always want to have conversations with me, from taxi drivers to, and this Chinese man came up to speak to me, and his English wasn't good. So half of the conversation was in Chinese, which I didn't understand. But I could make out from the English. And so, if phonetically the conversation would be something like, you know, you're from Nigeria. Very good people. No implementation. And so it would be like Chinese phrase, English phrase, Chinese phrase, English phrase. And I was completely entranced. But what it showed me is like the whole China contingent were actually very interested in talking about human rights in Africa, in Davos, which was interesting given their particular record with human rights. But what it teaches me, or what it gives me hope for, is this, that for so long the West has been able to afford to treat the rest of the world as its stomping ground. And with the rise of Turkey, with the rise of China and India, there has to be a new model for business. It's the model of collaboration. And the truth of the matter is, politics goes where money goes. So my complete belief is that the way the world is going now is moving more and more towards a model of collaboration through business. So American companies cannot dominate the Far East. Far East are dominating. For the first time now, we have a successful Nigerian stock exchange who's run by this woman who, oh my God, I love this woman. She's this Igbo woman who, Nigerian women are awesome, by the way. In case you didn't know, most of the things that have been accomplished in my country have been done by women. This is how, it's true. This is how powerful she is. She's a really big woman, and she was on stage with the Swiss president, and she was talking about what she'd done with the Nigerian stock exchange, and the Swiss president interrupted her, and she just went, "Excuse me, I'm talking." Which I was like, oh, that's so cool. But for the first time, Ngozi Konjiwala, who was our finance minister, reduced our foreign debt by 50%. The woman who, I forget her name now, who's in charge of the Nigeria's equivalent of the FDA, has so run it that if there's a sticker on any medication in Nigeria from her office, it's completely trusted. This has never happened before, not even when I was growing up. I mean, when I was growing up, you would go to a drugstore and you would ask for Advil, and they would ask you, do you want Germany or Taiwan? And basically, because in those days, Taiwan used to make the cheaper products. So basically, they're asking you, do you want the fake drugs or the real drugs? So even when I was growing up, there was different prices for the placebo and the real stuff. That doesn't happen anymore. So what's really beginning to emerge now is with the fight for Africa, for South America now, in these ways where the West and the other giants are beginning to, like China's suddenly where Russia was before, threatening the US as a superpower. There's new hope. And if it has to come through money, then let it come through money. So in a way, I actually am optimistic that Davos will lead to some change in that way. I don't know if I ever answered the question. I got kind of carried away with, you know, in Rwanda before the genocide, the word for rape and the word for marriage was the same word. After the genocide, that country is being rebuilt entirely by women. African women rock, man. It's true. Yes?
After all the experiences you've had in your life, would you still consider yourself Catholic? And how do you feel on religion now?
How many people here are Catholic or have been Catholic? Well, you all know you're never not Catholic. You spend the rest of your life trying not to be Catholic. I don't practice Catholicism anymore, but I do have a strong spiritual practice, which is, after I got kicked out of the seminary, I became a Tibetan Buddhist, and then I figured that wasn't working, and I joined a Hare Krishna ashram. And then when I wouldn't shave my head, they asked me to leave. I told you I got kicked out of things a lot. I've been a Sufi. I've been many things. And all I've sort of come to find, this is the thing I've come to find. There is no path. There is only a vague roadmap. And that ultimately, as long as you're striving towards something high in yourself, something, and I don't mean bigger than you, but even if it's just the ideal that you want a better political future, whatever you're doing that is striving towards something higher, that becomes your religion in a way. I mean, there's so many negative things one can say about religion, but it's a language that's so important to the human soul that I think we're never going to not have it. Nigeria's problem is that as soon as we get rid of the sort of ethnic problems, religions become new ethnicities. So fundamentalist Christians and fundamentalist Muslims have started up their trouble again, but I remain hopeful.